All right. Hi, everyone. Hi, nice to see you. Thank you so much for coming this evening to this talk by Claire Tancon. I'm going to give like a 2-second intro because we're a little behind schedule, and that's my fault. So I invited Claire to UW to be a part of the project that I run, which is called the Black Embodiment Studio, which is an arts writing incubator and public lecture series that really works to understand the concepts of Black and Blackness as concepts in and of themselves, and also as categories, aesthetics, and materials that move. So each quarter, graduate students apply to be in residence, and during that time, we spend our time reading a lot of arts writing about contemporary Black makers, but students are also developing their own pieces of short-form publishable arts criticism. And the goal is really to not only be able to reflect on kind of contemporary arts writing around Blackness, but to actually practice learning how to shape the discourse that you want to be seeing and participating in the world. So each quarter, we bring in a curator, an artist, and a scholar whose work kind of bridges arts and academic writing to give a public talk like we're going to see tonight, and also to host a kind of closed workshop with the BES residents to talk about their practice, talk about the talk in more detail, and just give students up close and personal kind of interaction with people whose practice models the kinds of work that we can be doing within and beyond the academy. I want to give a big thank you to Emily Zimmerman and the Jacob Lawrence Gallery. Without Emily's work, this whole project would have completely floundered a long time ago. And I want to thank the Simpson Center, which funds the Black Embodiment Studio, and this is the second year of funding, which is a really great, supportive environment to be in. And I want to thank Matt Howard, who is the new BES coordinator and has been entirely responsible for keeping me organized. So thank you to everybody. I'm not going to give a super intense kind of intro to Claire's work because her CV is really long and her bio is really rich. And so you can kind of Google the finer points, but I want to, so her excellent curatorial work has been done at museums and biennials across the globe, including in Benin, South Africa, Sweden, the US, and England. And in her curatorial work, Claire has highlighted the complex genealogies of African diasporic performance practices while explicitly pushing against the rigid, narrow definitions and descriptions of what curatorial and museum practices can look like. So I wanted to take a very brief minute to say that Claire's conceptual approach to processional performance itself, in her thinking with parades, marches, second lines, carnivals, and protests, it has played an instrumental role in my own intellectual development. I first saw Claire talk about her work at the Black Collectivities Conference held in 2013 at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. And her talk showed me that you can take performance seriously as a method of theorizing Blackness. That when you chart the ways that Blackness is staged in the density of a crowd, you're forced to ask more complex questions about race as movement, as matter, as aesthetics, as politics. So I look forward to tonight's talk, which presents new work and expands upon her history of looking at all of the moves that inhere in and circulate around Blackness by situating her conversation within the ongoing violence of dispossession that is being staged worldwide. And I'm going to leave the details of that talk to her. So there will be a Q&A after, and there will be a reception after, so don't be one of those people that runs when the talk is done, okay? So let's welcome Claire to the talk.
Yes, for seeing through with your invitation. Oh, yes. And my coming here. It's only my second time in Seattle. Last I was here was maybe about 2 years ago. And I know that some of you whom I met for the first time 2 years ago are here again this evening. So it's a double pleasure to be here. Thank you, Camille, for your generous introduction. I hope I will do justice to your invitation. And for sure, I will attempt to bridge both what of my practice you know and would have seen in Chicago way back when, which was still very much to do with the processional and processional performance as coming out of particular genealogies of Black aesthetic practices. And my current work, which is still very much cited within performance, but also somewhat broader, if you will, which is maybe more so focused on the topic of Blackness as a conceptual framework through which to read the contemporary, and not solely as applied to Black aesthetic practices, which then becomes a tremendous challenge for those who may not understand how Blackness, understood ontologically, can apply to their work, and certainly can be used as a frame through which to complexify what they might be looking at, whether African Americans or otherwise. It's very complicated to do in Europe, you can imagine, and it's even more complicated to do in the Gulf, which I will be speaking about, since I'm currently engaged in a curatorial project in Sharjah, one of the 7 Emirates that's sited in the Gulf of Arabia or the Oman Gulf, depending on which side of the peninsula you're looking at. So, I am much more of an extemporary speaker than I am an academic lecturer, and yet within the context of Kemi's invitation to the Black Embodiment Studio, which is an arts writing incubator in part, I thought that I would read from a few writings that have informed the formulation of my current artistic interest, and in turn are shaping my curatorial response to them, specifically within the context of Look for Me All Around You, which is the title of my project for the Sharjah Biennial. Oh, so am I not being heard enough? Yes?
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. Can you couldn't hear me well enough? No, now it's better? Okay, thank you so much. Yes, so I will not so much extemporize as I will attempt to read. Hopefully papers will not go flying too much. I'm usually very bad at keeping up to the page, but I will try, because again, I really want to read some writing. And the reason why it is critical for me to emphasize the importance of articulation is to do with at least there's at least 2 reasons why that's important to me. One has to do with the space of the Indian Ocean, which, as you know, from an American context, the Afro-Atlantic experience dominates the discourse on modern and contemporary Black art form, something which I was just discussing at a seminar entitled Black Modernisms, Plural, organized by Huey Copeland and Steve Nelson at the Center for Advanced Visual Studies at the National Gallery in Washington. And during the context of the Black Modernism seminar, which yet again was very much focusing on Afro-Atlantic aesthetic forms, I posited and asked the following. If the making of modernity is predicated upon the practice of diaspora, it follows that modernism, at the core, stems from a diasporic condition. And if modernism emerges from and as a diasporic condition, should we not ask that all diasporic components of alternative modernisms, as non-Western modernisms were once called, be accounted for their distinct spatial-temporal coordinates and spatial historical agents added on to said definition of Black modernisms? Simply put, can we speak of Black modernisms without accounting for all African diasporas? In attempting to formulate Black modernisms as an African diasporic phenomenon at large, or as an Afro-Oceanic rather than simply Afro-Atlantic phenomenon, my intention is on redirecting our compass away from a single American pointer on the Atlantic Ocean, but to circumnavigate instead a broader history of African diasporas from the less traveled routes of the Indian Ocean. And welcome, Melissa, and thank you for joining us. Melissa is the lovely colleague thanks to whom I first came to Seattle 2 years ago, as I was telling you. So I'm very happy to see her tonight. Thank you so much. Yes. The other instance, which is correlated to the Indian Ocean, why it is important for me to articulate with precisely on words my project for the Charja Biennial is a denial to embody blackness. In a context where Arabness trumps blackness, in the self-identificatory mechanisms of local Gulfian populations, where, to the exception of the use of the term Gulf African by African diasporic Dubai-based populations, or the more general term of Afro-Emirati, though coined by an Emirati scholar, an official activist, but for these few exceptions, the identification of Emirati citizens as black is vastly dismissed. So what that means is that whether there is a denial to embody blackness, or rather whether one might wonder how blackness is being embodied in a place where it cannot be spoken or seen, in a space where it inhabits the unspeakable and the invisible. Again, what words can be placed upon this condition? And for those of you who are, as I myself was, prior to engaging with the region, unfamiliar with it, we can discuss at greater length later. But it is a fact that the articulation of race in the UAE, or the simple recognition of ethnicity, is by and large dismissed, frowned upon, if not downright forbidden. It follows then that one arrives at a formulation of black embodiment. It follows then that the formulation of black embodiment in such a context is critical in light of the perils of cultural misunderstanding by non-Western host institutions. Such efforts of articulation fall in multiple double binds, such as at once formulating and unfocusing blackness to diffuse the possibility of offense and refraining from cultural relativism, yet claiming cultural rootedness. Such a task is rendered urgent in light of the inauguration in Sharjah in late September, just about a month ago, of the Africa Institute, a new cultural research and programming organization dedicated to the study of the cultural relationship between Arab and African cultures. I cannot help but wonder, how will the academic component of the Africa Institute face to the challenge of narrating the formation of Arab societies in the Gulf without negating slavery in the modern era? Slavery which was still in operation, if that is the right way to put it, until the middle of the last century. Another double bind thus forms: how to respect formerly enslaved Gulfian Africans or Gulfricans desire to assimilate into the tribal Arab system and later into the Emirati construction of undifferentiated citizenship, while at the same time in Aisha Bilker's words, and Aisha Bilker is the scholar who I would refer to as Afro-Emirati, who I also think couldn't possibly be more official in her capacity as the head of research at the National Archive in Abu Dhabi. And she's the one who quoted the term Afro-Emirati, which, as I was telling you, is nonetheless vastly dismissed. And in her words, it is important to arrive at a place where we can break the code of silence around this neglected topic of slavery as the first step in providing an accurate account of the slave's vital contribution to cultural settings, music, and worldviews of the host society. That's a nice way to put it. So I've been quoting from her. And maybe even more critically, but dangerously for me, how to intelligently pose the question of current forms of indentured South Asian labor in the Gulf as mayhap a continuation of forms of bondage with historical roots dating back to century-old slave systems in which African only played but a numerically minor yet culturally prevalent role, not unlike maybe a comparable, if distinct, contemporary phenomena in the Americas, in the United States, certainly today, in the unfinished aftermath of the slavery, 13th Amendment, Black Lives Matter's conundrum continuum. So you see how I begin to establish the premises for what in Look For Me All Around You is a comparison between the Americas and the Emirates, a comparison that may seem far-fetched at first, only if one, until one actually follows certain structures of development along the lines of slavery for one, only turning one's head away from the Atlantic Ocean and up the Indian Ocean instead, from the island of Zanzibar through to Sewell, the slave port of what is currently Oman, and into the Gulf, and look at times different but also similar populations that have been coerced into indentured labor in these regions of the world. So slavery for one, resource extraction for two, and forms of labor exploitation for three. And then this daring comparisons between the Americas and the Emirates begins to make more sense. Before getting to the Gulf, though, I wanted to share with you some writing that I did in the summer of 2016, and which begin to delineate how I conceived of the notion of the diasporic as an alternatively dispossessive and repossessive apparatic condition of the contemporary. So very wordy, but you will understand what it all means if you have not yet. The term of aporia simply means that there's an internal and somehow unresolvable contradiction at play within a concept, and that these contradictions are constitutive of it, if you will. And dispossession and repossession are critical because obviously the practice of diaspora is one through which, though there is much that is left or lost, there is also much that is, of course, accrued and created. So it is important, in my view, to constantly keep in mind both this aspect of phenomena of diasporization, which in this particular case I do not solely use to refer to the African or other diasporas, but more generally to account for an increasingly encroaching phenomenon through the various migrations that take place, and which all have a similar effect of dispossession. I have to remember that I have slides on dispossession, but actually much more texts, once again, than actual images, for I am very much in the process of scoring Look For Me All Around You, and though I have sketches and renderings and elements that I could share, that maybe I will share tomorrow in a smaller committee within the classroom, tonight is really about the text and the word, and the importance to articulate again within a context of the unspeakable. On dispossession, and so I will read this text again. This is the summer of 2016, and as you may remember, it was a particularly red summer with multiple deaths of primarily black, but also, primarily men, but also women. Death is of a dispossessive disposition. After the blood has dried or been drawn, the flesh desiccated and the bones turn brittle, the body at last dissipates. By disposing of the body, death dispossesses life of its ultimate materiality. Death, however, presupposes the privilege of life, the full possession of which can be denied the dispossessed. At once a desirable and destitute lot, the dispossessed can be identified alternatively as those self-dispossessed subjects liberated from the bounds of selfhood
through relational bonds with others. And of course, this is now looking into psychoanalytical terms in terms of how aspiring to self-dispossession is, of course, highly desirable when one maybe is an entitled full citizen of liberal democracy. There is also the other dimension of dispossession, far less desirable, for those for whom the ability to possess anything, from owning land to sustaining a livelihood to the right to citizenship and the right to life itself, is rendered impossible through the systematic and systemic deprivation of their human rights, the second-class citizens of these same liberal democracies and of other non-democratic regimes. The matter of dispossession, as concerned gender self-identification, for instance, is critical at this very moment, as we know when the Trump administration is looking into rewriting a far more heteronormative definition of gender. So you begin to understand what can be accounted for under the term and the notion of dispossession. But to feminist theorists Judith Butler and Athena Athanasiou, from whom I borrow the notion of dispossession, although, and I quote, we can only be dispossessed because we are always already dispossessed, ethically viable and politically effective dispossessed subjects must both seek self-othering in the ideal fulfillment of selfhood and resist destitution in the basic affirmation of life. How then can African Americans, among Africa's most enduringly disparaged and violently dispossessed, address this philosophical conundrum as a matter of material survival and resolve this aphoretic case in the urgency of life-saving tactics? That the unnatural disaster of Black Death might be possible is the outcome of the larger unchecked circumstances in which blacks in America are kept, social death, engendered by enslavism and racialism, diagnosed by historian Sharifa Rhodes-Spitz and art historian Huey Copeland as the contemporary manifestations of the unreconciled legacy of slavery and the protracted tangibility of race. Social death, once the marker of enslaved Africans, now marks their African American descendants with the scarlet letter of imminent destitution. For in America, the surplus violence engineered within liberal democracy and released through its weaponized arsenal has primarily befallen its black citizenry, to which the inalienable rights to life and liberty have been unequally distributed, while all other rights they subtend are in jeopardy. Civil rights assailed, voting rights, reproduction rights, etc., etc. Again, remember, I was writing this in the summer of 2016, where close to what was then home, which was New Orleans, Philando Castile was murdered in Baton Rouge. So this was all very, very close to home, quite literally. The already dispossessive disposition of the socially dead has been on daily display. As living, dying, and dead bodies have hailed for help, hollered in plain sight, shot up on the pavement, and held up the street. At times, they have elicited little more treatment than litter, left unattended in the middle of the road for hours on end, or shoved in the back end of police wagons to be bumped around to much the same end, death. Processions of the dispossessed, in turn awakening and mournful, have surged as the visibility of death by dispossession has increased exponentially, as Black life rises up in refusal to its terminal dismissal, and as citizens of conscience assemble to force the police to face justice. And of course, a contemporary example of a procession of the dispossessed, which is a term that I borrow from William Kentridge. Very interesting, but that's an aside. We can talk about it, and maybe if and when this essay is developed in published form, I will explain more why Kentridge's work is critical, actually. But an example of a procession of dispossessed is, of course, the migrant caravans. and certainly migrant deemed illegal or certainly paperless in the US are among the most currently destitute as well. So the form of the processional somehow has vast resonance across a broad artistic but also social and political spectrum if you take into account said caravans but also demonstration, marches, all forms of mass assembly as modes of public address, if you will. I'm going into the second section of this text again, which is 2 years old, to show a few examples of some of the work, some of the artistic practices that I was looking at the time as they were being made in response to the Red Summer of 2016. The festering pandemic of murders has become a macabre carnival whereby, in a criminal reversal, policemen unload their weapons in shooting drives like gangbangers on drive-by shootings. Suspension of disbelief needs not apply when coffins erupt in the streets as so many masks of protest. And of course, I'm using here the notion of the mask as not solely something which covers the face, but which is itself carried, and the means through which other levels of consciousness can emerge. And here I am juxtaposing the work of Ebony Patterson to the left, which coincidentally myself and art history professor Krista Thompson commissioned back in 2014 within the context of the Jamaican Carnival, a piece which originally was meant for Patterson to account for the lost lives of those who got caught in the crossfire. I don't know if you remember, way back when, I can't quite myself remember, but there was a drug lord by the name of Dudus who was heavily searched, including by American forces, which descended upon Jamaica and just shot around. And so many folks died in the process, and she created a tribute to them in the kind of a bling aesthetic, which is then borrowed for their funerals. If you cannot see me while I am alive, you will see me while I am dead. It's kind of the idea behind the bling funeral. And so this piece of ebony was taken up without her permission, unfortunately, much to her upset, by Black Lives Matter Toronto, which used the shape of the coffins, as you can see on the left, for their own protest. Now, much as I had to support Ebony, if only because myself and my co-curator were behind commissioning her work, I thought it quite revealing that she had created such a form that it was able to translate from the site of a popular manifestation for one, Carnival in Jamaica, also the site of an artistic project, her commission work for En Masse, Carnival and Performance Out of the Americas, as was the title of the show, and then into the real world life, if you will, of an actual protest in the streets of Toronto. So that's what this is about. So not only did you have these masks of protest, but you also had a black flag with ominous wording raised in piratical defiance. I'm of course referring to the Jolly Roger of the pirates, because piracy is very important to me. But in this case, of course, as you may know, of this project of Dred Scott, which he displayed in many different ways, of course brandished in demonstrations here in Union Square, but also displayed at Jack Chainman Gallery, outside, then upon a neighbor's protest back in the gallery, but very much in reference to an NAACP earlier such flag, only without the critical word that incriminates the criminals under to be indicted, the police. A man was lynched yesterday to a man was lynched by police yesterday. And then Another form of work that emerged were banners with soothing verses. In this case, in the work of Colin Smith, borrowing from Gwendolyn Brooks, Conduct Your Blooming. In the case of this piece, the Black Love Procession. This work with the banners is one which she reprised for the Whitney Biennial. I cannot remember the name of her project there, but I know that she was looking at the book, she was looking at Christina Sharp's book. And mayhap actually the title of a piece for the Whitney is after Christina Sharp's book, if anyone knows the title of the book and can... In the Wake, thank you so much. Yes, I think this was the title of Ebony's piece at the Whitney. So again, a form of march, of protest that she's been using time and again in her work, again as a mode of public address. So again, this was 2016. When the live and live-stream spectacle of bloodied flesh, last breath, lifeless bodies and suspended lives don't seem to matter, can symbolic objects called to the rescue act as surrogates for the still alive and the barely dead to perform materiality in this communal jest of liminality, then manifested within the Black Lives Matter movement and other affiliated movements? How can one figure the contour of the black body, thus constructed, of the wooden frame of a coffin for bone, and the fabric of a flag for flesh, and figure out the political performative purchase of, and I quote, the political ontological position of black subjectivity, this is from Huey Copeland, to contemporary militant gestures at Black Lives Matter's protest. Can, and I quote from Atanasiu, alternative economy of bodies, demonstrated again by the protesters whose work we have seen, and I quote this time from Sharifa Rhodespist, provide a mathematical equation for an economic model that does not end with another black shooting. And this was a brilliant text by Sharifa Rhodespist from Slavery to Ferguson, which she published in the New York Times, in the T magazine of, and I finished this section simply, and for those of you who have read Joseph Roach, Cities of the Dead, this is from whom I borrow the term of surrogation, and also the idea of the vast city of the dead that the streets of the US became to form, with bodies washing up on the pavement, blood spilled, and breath interrupted. And I'm slowly transitioning now towards my project in Sharjah with a few measures from... oh, do we have sound? Sorry, I didn't think of asking. Oh.
It's on already. Let me get my tech guy.
No worries. I'm using this soundtrack, which is from a film that is currently being shot by Cecilia Tripp, one of the artists whom I have invited to present at Look For Me All Around You. And well, if we somehow manage to play it, and I'm so sorry, Kemi, I should have told you I had some media. But if you manage to play it, I won't disclose what it is, and if we don't, I will. It appears again later in my presentation. On unlooking. And so, again, you understand how I have just read through this text, which I wrote in the summer of 2016, and where I was assaying this notion of dispossession as an operatic condition of the contemporary under the guise of diasporization. And now I continue in reading the series of texts that I have developed since, again, to account for the particular historical, social, political, artistic, and cultural circumstances within which my project is cited. And again, I do so, as I told you, because of the necessity to articulate in the context of the unspeakable, the necessity to mayhap withdraw from the gaze, paradoxically though it may seem, under condition of invisibility, but for me very much to desist from the retinal and to resist from availing to visual consumption the bodies of others, which are forever availed to demeaning tasks, or when staged, very much so in rather exploitative conditions. So it becomes important to reflect upon the meaning of the exhibitionary for one, and of exhibiting bodies and objects for that matter within a certain cultural context. I'm going to stop extemporizing because otherwise I will never get to the end of my text. One of the, a critical figure in my work in general has been David Hammons. And in many ways, Look for Me All Around You is bookended by two works by David. One is Concerto in Black and Blue, a piece which was done at Pace Gallery back in 2002 or 3. And it consisted in an empty and darkened gallery space, which the audience members were able to maneuver thanks to the blue lights that they were being given and the sound of a koto harp playing in the distance. And for more, you should be looking into this fantastic piece of David, which has been, which is the topic or the starting point actually of a great book by art historian Darby English, How to Look or How to See a Work of Art in Complete Darkness. And it's also been looked at currently, among many other folks, of course, by Kobina Mercer on a current project of his called Blackness Invisible. So I continue reading. What if obscurity were the harbinger of futurity, darkness the sight of seeing, and blackness the scene of unmasking? What would a contrapuntal proposal to the realm of the retinal, embedded within hegemonic structures of looking, learning, and feeling, look like? Would it look like an address to the redistribution of the sensible, a call for the repossession of perception, a site where what is being looked at is not what is being looked for, if only it could be seen? One of the characteristics of this text that I develop and within which I seek to give clues rather than full disclosure of meaning is intertextuality. So there's any numbers of references that some of you might recognize or not. Within this context, I'm happy to share what they are with you. When I speak of a redistribution of the sensible, I'm referring to the work of French philosopher Jacques Rancière. And when I speak of a repossession of perception, which is more critical to me, I make reference to the work of Jonathan Crary in Suspension of Perception, Spectacle, Modernity, and Attention, Spectacle, and Modern Culture, I think is the right subtitle. And why? Because in this book, Jonathan Crary diagnosed the state of vision in the or the state of rather perception in the 19th century in the Western world. And he describes how it is increasingly going the way simply of the retinal, with an emphasis on vision and specifically on focused vision. And so to me, repossessing a fuller spectral, a fuller sensorial spectrum is critical in terms of divesting from precisely this economy of the gaze to which those construed of as others often fall victim. Searchlights on the open seas of disaster, flickering flames in the encampments of catastrophe, and night vigils of foreclosed hope foreshadow encroaching conditions of dispossession and diasporization, no longer confined to the wretched of the earth, but reaching our planetary humanity and standing witness to the imperilement of the contemporary in the atomized space between me and you. Borrowing from the articulation of an early historical call for collective African diasporic self-determination, this site of looking for me all around you reconsiders the legacies of broader African, European, Asian, and Middle Eastern cultural circuits, ecological collaborations, and political circulations to and from the Americas to claim their locality, subjectivity, and specificity for the worldling of the present. In this first text, I am not yet disclosing fully the reference to Marcus Garvey, but I am alluding to it when I am speaking of early historical call for collective African diasporic self-determination. Defining blackness as a state of consciousness, darkness as a political position, and obscurity as enlightenment from the law, this site defies standards of display predicated upon the notion of exhibition, where the lines between objects and bodies, once drawn on essentialist grounds, continue to be drawn to much the same materialist ends. And this brings us to the other bookend of Look for Me All Around You, again with a piece by David Hammonds, which is very much again, disavowing the gaze and removing from retinal consumption the objects that would normally be on display, and which is instead hiding from view at the base of the pedestal. So, on the one hand, with Conservative in Black and Blue, this fuller sensorial spectrum of which I speak, with, well, first, the blinding of vision, the inability to see, the enhancements of the ear and the emphasis on the oral with the sound of the koto harp. And in this particular case, much more so looking at material culture and the way in which the material production of certain populations, in this particular case Africans, one can decipher upon closer inspection the look of what one can assume to be the feet of African statuettes. How such objects, non-Western, were, as you know, very much subjected to anthropological modes of display, rather so than artistic, and even so, a general resistance to the very notion of exhibiting and its long history, specifically within international exhibition, of displaying not just objects, but bodies as standing thereof. I will skip on a few more words. I may need a look at my watch or signs from Kemi every now and again, but so far so good. Yes, good, super. I speak of disidentification and misrecognition, of piracy, clandestinacy, and fugitivity, all of which you can understand based on solely from the work of David Hammonds, the turn towards the oral, the challenge to the prosthetics of the display apparatus, and the desire for me to produce an always already othered time-space continuum, which I have coined in another wordy term, which is heterochronotopic. It's interesting because it brings together the notion of heterotopia, of course Foucault's, and the notion of the chronotope, which is Bakhtin, but in this case very much reworked through Paul Gilroy, who refers to the ship, the slave ship of course, as the paragon of the modern chronotop. So it is Gilroy's acception of the word chronotop, which I seek to use with the notion of the heterochronotopic, which I translate as the always, already, other time-space continuum, or put more simply, a third space. And certainly, among the artists whom I have invited to do new work as part of Look For Me All Around You is the great Wu Tseng, who through a dual projection setup is carving or allowing for a third space to merge at the encounter and dissolving the edge of both these spaces. And so it is that third space which I am after. And of course, there's any numbers of variation on the third. Terceira metade, metade, as the Brazilians would have it, third text, tiers état, etc., etc. And again, since I'm freshly back from the incredible Black Modernism seminar, where I had the pleasure to listen to Kobina Mercer up close, he reminded us, as I will remind you and myself, that in Black cultural criticism, we tend to reinscribe a dualism of the sonic and the visual instead of focusing on their doubleness. And so this is critical because indeed, as Brian Cornwood recently noticed for my colleagues of the Sharjah Bayanian and myself made a presentation at SVA last week, he noted the semantic field of the sonic in the various texts that I have produced. And again, it is not so much about pitting one sense against another, but rather to find ways where they can cohabit for, again, a repossession of a fuller spectral spectrum. And with it, of course, the idea of, or the aspiration towards higher levels of consciousness. On coding, or rather, uncoded language, which is, of course, falls within a diasporic tradition, which we know well. I am glad that I did not include an excerpt from the master himself, the master of the word. I will read instead. Light years are interchangeable with years of living in darkness. The role of darkness is not to be seen as or equated with ignorance, but with the unknown and the mysteries of the unseen. Thus, in the name of Robson, Godson, Hurston, Akhenaton, Whitman, Baldwin, Ginsberg, Kaufman, Oshun, Obatala, Ogun, Siddhartha, Medusa, Guevara, Kennedy, King, four little girls, those who burned, those still aflame, and the countless unnamed. We claim the present as present, as the hereafter. We are unraveling our navels so that we may ingest the sun. We are not afraid of the darkness. We trust in the mood shall guide us. Coded language with lyrics, excerpts, Saul Williams and Kirk Thompson. The date is 2001. Things happen. I fell back upon coded language as I was coding my own. And of course, very much cited within the register of darkness and spoken in the language of course, the sonic. It's a very well-known piece, of course, by Saul. You can see it, hear it online, and it's just incredible. In his unrelenting address to look for me in the whirlwind or a storm, look for me all around you. There we go. Marcus Mosiah Garvey Jr. In 1925, as he is about to be imprisoned in Atlanta on account of trumped-up mail fraud charges in his aborted enterprise of the return journey to the continent. With these terms, he issued no less than a call to the miraculous arms of mass movement and migration as salvation and redemption. Reverberating across 3 continents, the ultimate organizing method for diasporic politics What of Garvey's legacy can be resurrected in the present, and to what ends? Mass mobilization has been on the rise through many failed and aborted springs, as has mass migration in the aftermath of much the same failed. Trails of drowning death, farming of bones, pathways to enslavement, mass graves, organ trades, dispossessive living dispositions, formerly fancied as bare-lived, ponder anew the weight of the body. Short up shoes, tattered rags, body parts, blankets, carpets and pillows, the Bangla camps, the Libyan pens, the Parisians' outskirts, the Mexican wall mirage point toward material accounting. What of artistic practices, material productions, memories, histories, archives under such dispossessive living condition? And so the material conditions of the dispossessive within contemporary life is one with which my colleagues in Living the Echo Chamber, which is the general umbrella under which we make our contributions, it is something which we are all three of us very much concerned, each singularly with our respective platforms. And I continue reading. Can an allegedly universal museum collection under Napoleonic watch in up-teens generation imperialism tame the material production of humankind into a museological masquerade of history? I'm of course here referring to and pointing out to the Louvre Abu Dhabi. For me, in this context, the task lies in testing exhibitionary tools that may counter the establishment of Western franchised museum of so-called universal history, which instrumentalize non-Western histories as footnotes to teleological developments of neo-imperial narratives. It is really rather, I have no words clearly, glaring to visit the Louvre Abu Dhabi and to arrive at this point where, in its very kind of unidirectional perspective, you find yourself faced with a portrait of the war looter that Napoleon was, of course, thanks to whom the very collections of museums were formed. And it is not just a portrait of Napoleon, for there are many in imperial garb, for instance, but it is a portrait of the warlord, and I find it so incredibly egregious. And so there you have it. This is one of the masterpieces that Le Louvre loaned to Le Louvre Abu Dhabi, and which is on display. It's kind of a culminating the first round of the visit after going through various antiquities, Etruscan, Egyptians, and otherwise. This is the conclusion of the section. I strongly recommend you read. There's been many, of course, articles, including some very critical on the Louvre Abu Dhabi, but there's one that I recommend from Even magazine, which is a really, really great magazine for those of you who know it or will come to know about it. So if you're looking for a good criticism of the Louvre Abu Dhabi, I would recommend Even magazine. And so, of Look for Me All Around You, I state that I would like for it to be more of a durational exhibition that is reinserted within kind of a global almanac, attuned to the rhythms of many displaced time and space, a heterochronotopia, including the time and space of the sun, noon, and midday, the call to prayer, the Paellas festival back in the Philippines, the observance of Ramadan, the anniversary of Bandung, the celebration of Holi, any occasion, situation, location worthy of presence, wherever home and country might be. There's a section that I forgot to read, which was about how the Sharjah Art Foundation, by contrast, is attempting to propose a counter to this universalizing narrative, as can be found in Abu Dhabi, but also in Qatar, with another museum which I think builds itself not as a universal museum, but a global museum. Same difference. So that is why you have here a bird's eye view of the new spaces of the Sharjah Art Foundation, which you can see as embedded within the fabric of the old city. And so, again, I am taking you in my journey of articulating, look for me all around you at different times, for different audiences, different understandings. And here, I think, is the third text which I wrote, and I'm inching ever more closely to what is at stake. And there's, I had two quotes. There's only one which I share, but the two quotes are: you see only what you look for, you recognize only what you know. Meryl Sussman. And a beautiful sentence by Edouard Glissant: rien n'est vrai, tout est vivant, nothing is true, all is living. Of course, there's different ways of translating tout est vivant. So living is a good one, but it could also be all is alive. Rien n'est vrai, tout est vivant. And I proceed to reading. Is it because you are from and of a place that you see the place in every place and any place? Is it because you are from and of the Caribbean that you see the Caribbean everywhere anyhow? You saw the Caribbean in Campania, though you were not looking for it. You saw Soufrières in Mount Vesuvio and Saint-Pierre as Pompeii still. Soufrière is the name of a volcano that you can find both in Guadeloupe, but also in other islands in the Caribbean. And Saint-Pierre is a city that is well known for having been entirely destroyed, much as Pompeii, in the island of Martinique. Is it because you live in the Gulf of Mexico that your mind cartographs all gulfs in like fashion and approximates Mexicans, Texans, and Californians to Omanis, Emiratis, and Bahrainis, risking territorial misdiagnosis? Is it because you oftentimes nestle in New Orleans that you sometimes dream of Ramadan through the lens of Mardi Gras? Daytime fast as diurnal Lent, nighttime celebration as nocturnal carnival. But could I have ever dreamt of the morning of that day, on the morning of that a day would come when an imam would take me on the rooftop of his mosque, almost at the top of its minaret? I figured that the Gulf of Oman was the Antillean archipelago of the Indian Ocean, Zanzibar, the Gorée Island of the East, Gingera State, the birthplace of Sidi Toussaint. I learned about the sure certitude of slavery in the Indian Ocean and read into the possible plausibility of piracy in the Arabian Gulf as a certain sign of accomplished Creoleness. Now, this is very wordy by design because one of the first book of history in Sharjah is called The Myth of Arab Piracy in the Gulf, and it denies the maritime activities of the Al-Qasimi as of piratical nature. So the notion of piracy is therefore very contentious. And to me, of course, as a daughter of the Atlantic, I know nothing but piracy, only the different body of water. Here, dates, not calendrical dates, but dates the fruit, dispersed east and west, pearls imported north, there, sugarcane, cotton, tobacco, milled into future decay, spun into fabric of hardly better cloth, chewed up into cancer, a world-around attraction for extraction and disposition towards exploitation, oil spilling everywhere. I have known all along that the whole world was in the Caribbean, the north, the south, the centers, the east and its middle, the middle and its passage, the west and its former. We have long desisted from the struggles of anti, no longer resist from the place of post, and have never existed in the negative space of none. This rebellion against negative formulations is one between you and I, which I very much directed at an exercise that I did not fully understand in all curatorial collegiality, which was that of the 10th Berlin Biennial. We don't need another hero, and a related education program, which was I am not who you think I am not. It is far more difficult to formulate positive definitions than negative ones. It is, I think, more courageous to affirm rather than negate. And this is the reason for this string of anti and nons being resisted. You have grown up with ghosts of the island's first peoples, descendants of unmastered Europeans, enslaved Africans and indentured Indians, Lebanese and Syrian immigrants, Haitian and Dominican refugees, metropolitan French folks and North American tourists, Muslim and Hindus, Catholics and Christians of every hue and cults of a kind. But these are notes of no return. There has been no Godfrey and Garvey. Afro-Americans are no African Americans of the messianic make of the Jamaican Zionist. They are said not to long for a homeland and to identify as part of no community other than Arab. Second and third generation UAI born resident of parents from all along the Indian Ocean coast and the Arabian Peninsula don't seem to care anyway, for homeland is where home is. Are our dreams really nearly half a century old? Your 1969 vision of Pan-Africanism and Pan-Arabism joining forth, with Algeria as the capital of the Arab world, Cuba as Latin America's Mecca, and Vietnam leading Asia. What is left of Pan-Af, which, by the way, which celebrate its 50th anniversary next year? Are you circling around in a Lewa dance, woman, though you are cannot? Etc., etc. I will fast forward because there are but a few, but only but a few, Kemi, more slides that I will show and words which I will speak, and more so directly related to giving clues about look for me all around you, which I am currently in the process of scoring, as you understand. And these various texts, of course, functions as annotations in this process. And as you understand, of course, maybe the metascore is the Garveyite text, by which I mean the way in which he wrote into the minds of 1930s, 40s black folk, the dream of the possibility, not so much of a return, but of a pride in being black, of the knowledge of belonging to a much wider network than simply that of the land onto which they showed up. And that network was of the Caribbean and the Americas at large, but also very much the African continents, where there were many a Garveyite cell in activity. And of course, when I came up with Look for Me All Around You as the title for my platform in Sharjah, I wasn't so much planning to go Garvey. It simply is a sentence that is, in my view, very poetic and open to many different interpretations, which the various artists invited have taken up just as. It simply is also a sentence which, as many Caribbean scholar would know, it's the title of a book which very much speaks of Caribbean achievements in the Americas, but also of their subservience to a greater African American narrative as a minority therein. And so it simply is a sentence which I knew, and but having come up with it as the title of my platform, I of course thought it fitting to give credit to who credit was due and to attempt to follow the possibility of this global definition of what blackness could be. And in doing so, I became aware of the fact that Garvey was very much taken up in scholarship, but also in artistic practice. And in scholarship, that is the case with this book, which again, I really like to give credit where credit is due. It is our friend Kojo Eshun of the Athlete who pointed it out to me, The Age of Garvey, how a Jamaican activist created a mass movement that changed global black politics. It's a very interesting book because its focus is very precisely not so much on Garvey's race politics, which are very much out of date, but on the dimension of this unprecedented and indeed the largest mass movement in the world. And then next up was Tracy Rose, who in her 2017 Performa Commission was also looking back at Garvey and for her thinking about the return as reparation. So just very interesting to see how a contemporary, the relevance of Marcus Garvey had been made at least by, in this case, a scholar and an artist. Other ways through which I define the platforms, which by now you will readily understand in terms of migrant images and fugitive forms, scores and scales, still very much this semantic field of the sonic. And here, maybe simply to manifest this process of scoring, thrown on the slide the names of all 28 artists who have been invited, whom I have invited, and I'm currently commissioning new works, and also, in some cases, the very poetic and suggestive titles which they have come up with, and which very much inform my writing and thinking about Look For Me All Around You. So, At the Time of the Ebb is the title of a film by Alia Farid, a young Kuwaiti Puerto Rican artist. Even the Stars Look Lonesome is from Maya Angelou. It is the title of Cecilia Tripp's work. Omnipresence is the title of James Clayton, a great sound artist and writer. Infinite Sun is the title of a piece by Annie Dawson. Spectres of Noon is the title of Jennifer Alora and Guillermo and Casadilla's work. Otherwise History is the title of Torquace Tyson's work. Anyway, The Wind Blows is good old Freddie Mercury, and that is the temporary title of Tracy Rose's piece. Mercury, as I had forgotten or maybe never knew, who was actually from Zanzibar. Persian by way of, Indian by way of Persia, and ultimately Zanzibarian. And lastly, Taste of Tears, the title of a piece by Carlos Martial, the performance artist originally from Cuba. And I wanted to conclude with sound, which we do not have, but it's okay. Or maybe I can try again. Yeah?
No, I think it's this.
Ah, okay. Oh, wonderful. Let's see. Somehow, on the computer, it just keeps on showing no sound.
Oh, okay.
You see, somehow.
Did you try to play it and see? My tech guy said that it might work.
Yeah, no, I mean, let's see. Well, you will have to come to Sharjah to hear it. So, I guess here ends my cursory introduction to Look For Me All Around You and matters of black embodiment or the denial thereof related to it and contended with in this particular context. Thank you so much.
Let's just
think it's all very dense. But I am, yes, very happy to answer any and every question. Some of the texts that I read, at least one is available online and the other is not, might be published. But I really, of course, was thinking through words and really the words of the artist as well, very much. And of course, any numbers of scholars to whom I refer, even as I am, of course, very much aware and at the same time wary of simply resorting to American academic discourses in a place that is both resistant to it, but also maybe also unaware of it, and maybe inappropriate for its unfolding, if you will, as the historical conditions are really quite distinct. Yes?
Given that, I'm really curious what kinds of conversations you're having at the facility and with your colleagues.
You know, it's really interesting because I never really know what is acceptable or not. I find out as I go along, and it's surprising where the sensitivities may come. So, for instance, I was very casually using the term Afro-Emirati because, after all, it's been coined, as I told you, by Aisha Bilher, who cannot be more possibly official. As I said, she's the head researcher at the National Archives in Abu Dhabi, and I was introduced to her by the foundation. But I began using the term, and I was told how I couldn't do so casually because I may offend people. And in fact, the person to whom I was speaking was clearly being offended. Further, I learned from another colleague who works at another public arts organization in Abu Dhabi that he had begun using the term Afro-Emirati in his programming and had stopped because some audience members would simply stand up and leave. So, of course, the difficulty is that, one always has to be very cautious with regards to one's ignorance and arrogance at the same time, in terms of interpreting or projecting meaning too quickly onto a situation to which one is only but cursorily introduced to. And so, yes, the conversations are often guarded and very cautious and very timid. And what is further surprising, but to me, in a way make the task more complicated, is that the opening of the Africa Institute, at the helm of which will be a well-heeled American academic, is not seemingly, from what I heard of the official opening discourse, shedding any light on why there would be Emiratis of African descent in the first place. So I heard everything from, the relationship between Arab and African population dating back to the dawn of time, easy enough, to beginning in the 1970s. And in between the dawn of times and 1970s, there's a big gap. So I don't really know how this could work. Of course, there is a way that, the programmation can be very much about contemporary African or African diasporic manifestations that need not resorting to a local narrative of slavery. At the same time, I don't see how this could possibly last for very long. But for now, I would say that the particular Emirate of Sharjah is certainly putting itself in a position to be challenged and to open itself up by inviting so many potentially divergent voices, which it does to some extent need to allow to speak or to articulate, however differentially so, thoughts and knowledges. So that's what I can say about the discussions. My colleagues Omar Khalef and Zoe Butt are not commissioning as much and are resorting less to site and context specificity. Therefore, certain issues simply do not come up, if you will. But gender certainly is to be very cautiously addressed. I would say, in my recent experience, even more so than race, and somehow race even more so than slavery. I was surprised by that, because in a way, even though slavery is still of a very recent past in the UAE, and one can allege maybe of the very present, only with other populations. And I don't know if this is one reason why, by fear of such a connection being made, that there is no public discourse on historical slavery. But somehow the formulation of an ethnically specific identity, be it Black or Persian, in as much as it touches upon this very nascent national construction, is very, very, very sensitive. So,
I want to thank Claire again for being here and for all of us to abide together now. So thank you.